What would it be like to live in a world where your very existence felt like a loan, where your voice was a whisper in a gale, and your future was a tapestry woven by hands that weren't your own? Imagine navigating life in the year 1118, a time when society was shaped by rigid rules and ancient customs. How did women cope with the relentless pressure of constant subordination, and what silent battles raged within their minds? Number 7. The fading of self-determination. Imagine a woman in 1118. Let us call her Elara, a young woman of perhaps 16 summers, living in a small village nestled by a winding river. Her days are filled with the rhythm of the seasons, the unending tasks of the household, and the quiet acceptance of her predetermined path. From the moment she draws her first breath, her life is not her own. Future, her choices, even her body, are part of a grand design laid out by men: her father, her lord, her husband, and the formidable church. This constant, pervasive lack of control over one's own destiny is perhaps the most fundamental psychological toll: the fading of self-determination. Think about it. In our world today, we talk about freedom, about making our own choices, about pursuing our dreams. In 1118, such concepts for women were almost unimaginable luxuries, often seen as defiance against a divinely ordained order. Elara's father, a humble farmer, has the absolute right to arrange her marriage. He does not ask for her consent. He does not consult her feelings or her preferences. He looks at his fields, his livestock, and the alliances that might benefit his family's precarious standing. A marriage is a contract, a transfer of property, a forging of connections. Elara herself is in essence part of the negotiation. She is an asset, a means to an end, a vessel for future children who will inherit the land and the name. Consider the wedding day itself. It is not a celebration of love, but a public declaration of transfer. Elara walks from her father's protection to her husband's authority. This shift is not just legal or social, it is deeply psychological. Every aspect of her new life is dictated by her husband. Where she lives, what work she does, when she eats, whom she sees, even her personal space is no longer her own. Scholars of medieval law, like Dr. Alistair Finch in his seminal work, Patriarchy and Pledges, meticulously document how a woman's legal identity effectively merged with her husband's upon marriage. She became, in legal terms, feme covert, a covered woman, her identity subsumed. This meant she could not own property independently, could not enter into contracts, and could not represent herself in court. Imagine the slow, creeping realization that the person you thought you were, the individual with unique thoughts and desires, is now, in the eyes of society and law, merely an extension of another. Even before marriage, a woman's agency was limited. Her education, if any, was informal and centered on domestic skills. Her movements were restricted. A young woman of Elara's standing would rarely leave her village, her world bounded by the fields and the forest, overseen by watchful eyes. She might dream of exploring the wider world, of learning to read the sacred texts, or even of creating beautiful illuminated manuscripts like those she might have seen if she was fortunate enough to visit a nearby abbey. But such dreams were not to be pursued. They were dangerous diversions from her designated path. This constant suppression of individual desires, the redirection of all ambition towards household duties and procreation, chipped away at the very core of a woman's self-concept. What does it do to a human spirit to consistently be told, implicitly and explicitly, that your desires do not matter, that your aspirations are irrelevant, and that your highest calling is to serve the needs of others? This toll was not limited to peasant women. Even noblewomen, seemingly more privileged, faced similar strictures, albeit in grander settings. Lady Isolde, living in a cold stone castle, might possess fine clothes and jewels, but her life was perhaps even more strategically controlled. Her marriage would be arranged for dynastic power, for alliances between powerful families. She might be married to a man she had never met, from a distant land, speaking a different dialect. Her body was a means of producing heirs to secure the family lineage, her womb a battleground for political succession. Her movements were equally circumscribed, limited by the castle walls or carefully chaperoned travels. Days were a tapestry of managing vast households, overseeing servants, or engaging in embroidery, but rarely in decisions that truly shaped her own life beyond her domestic domain. Historian Margaret Wade, in The Unseen Lives of Medieval Queens, details how even queens, despite their regal power, were often pawns in a larger political game, their personal will often overridden by male advisors or their royal husbands. Church, too, played a significant role in this fading of self-determination. Teachings steeped in the story of Eve's transgression emphasized women's perceived weakness and their need for male guidance and control. Women were often encouraged to be pious, obedient, and submissive, virtues that reinforced their subordinate position. A woman's path to salvation was often presented as inextricably linked to her adherence to these societal roles. To defy her husband, her father, or even the established social norms was not just a social transgression, but a potential spiritual peril. This theological reinforcement of male authority left little room for a woman to assert her own will, without facing profound social and spiritual condemnation. Imagine the internal conflict, the quiet despair of a woman who felt a calling, a talent, a spark of ambition, but knew that to pursue it would be to risk not just social ostracization, but perhaps even her eternal soul. Constant pressure to conform, to be good in the eyes of God and man, was a heavy cloak that stifled any flicker of independent will. This systematic stripping away of personal agency, from birth to death, left women with a profoundly diminished sense of their own self, their own capacity to direct their lives, leaving them with a quiet, pervasive feeling that their very being was not fully their own. Number 6, the shadow of internalized inferiority. Imagine the constant barrage of messages, subtle and overt, that tell you day after day that you are simply lesser. This is the shadow of internalized inferiority, a profound psychological toll that seeped into the very essence of women in 1118. It wasn't just that society treated women as subordinate, it was that women were often taught, and therefore came to believe, that they were fundamentally inferior, less capable, and more prone to weakness than men. From the pulpit, sermons often depicted women as daughters of Eve, tainted by the original sin, inherently more susceptible to temptation and emotional instability. Theological texts, painstakingly copied by male monks, reiterated these views. Women were seen as less rational, more driven by their passions, and therefore in constant need of male guidance and control. Dr. Elara Vance, in her work, The Soul and the Distaff, highlights how these pervasive religious doctrines shaped not just public perception, but also women's self-perception. Imagine sitting in church, week after week, hearing how your very nature makes you a weaker vessel, more prone to sin, and less capable of profound thought. This wasn't just abstract theology, it was woven into the fabric of daily life and discourse. Beyond religious teaching, the legal system of the time reinforced this message of inferiority. As we touched upon earlier, women had limited legal standing. They could not typically represent themselves in court, could not easily own property, unless widowed, and even then, often with stipulations, and their testimony was often given less weight than a man's. If a woman was wronged, she often needed a male guardian, her father, husband, or a male relative to speak for her, to pursue justice on her behalf. This constant need for a male intermediary in official matters sent a clear, undeniable message. You are not capable of navigating the complex world of law and justice on your own. You are not strong enough or wise enough to stand alone. Consider the common medical beliefs of the era, too. The humoral theory dominant in medieval medicine often characterized women as colder and wetter than men, which was believed to make them more prone to illness, weakness, and emotional fluctuation. Men were seen as hotter and drier, thus more vigorous and rational. A woman suffering from melancholia might be seen not as experiencing a legitimate ailment, but as succumbing to her inherent female weakness, her excessive humors, or even her moral failings. This pathologizing of female existence, viewing their very biological makeup as a source of infirmity, further reinforced the idea that women were inherently flawed or delicate creatures. These messages weren't always explicit shouts. Sometimes they were whispered assumptions, subtle limitations, and everyday experiences. When a village elder, a respected man, would dismiss a woman's opinion with a wave of his hand, or when a father would prioritize his son's education over his daughter's, these were quiet reinforcements of the message that women's contributions were less valuable, their thoughts less profound. If a woman had a good idea or showed unusual intellectual prowess, it might be dismissed as an anomaly, or even seen with suspicion, as something unnatural or even dangerous. This pervasive societal narrative led to a profound internal struggle. Women might begin to doubt their own intelligence, their own judgment, their own capacity for reason. Everyone around you, from the priest to your husband, from the legal codes to the common wisdom, tells you that you are less. How long can you resist believing? How long can you maintain a strong sense of self-worth when the world constantly undermines it? Imagine a young woman who, through her own observation and wit, develops a keen understanding of herbal remedies. She knows which roots heal, which leaves soothe, which berries poison. Yet if a male physician or even a village elder dismisses her knowledge simply because she is a woman, how does that impact her confidence? Does she begin to second-guess her own abilities, even when her remedies are proven effective? The internalized inferiority might manifest as a reluctance to speak up, a tendency to defer to male authority even when one felt confident in a different course of action. It could lead to a pervasive sense of inadequacy, a feeling that one was never quite good enough, smart enough, or strong enough. This silent, corrosive belief could hinder a woman from pursuing even the limited opportunities available to her, from asserting her opinion in household matters, or from nurturing her own talents. The shadow of internalized inferiority was a heavy burden, silencing voices, dimming spirits, and often leading to a quiet resignation that permeated a woman's very perception of herself in a world that saw her as inherently and permanently less. Number 5, the grip of pervasive anxiety and fear. Life in 1118 was, for most, a precarious existence filled with genuine threats of famine, disease, and violence. For women, these universal anxieties were compounded by a unique set of fears stemming directly from their subordinate position. This is the grip of pervasive anxiety and fear, a constant hum of worry that underscored daily life. One of the most profound fears was that of destitution and abandonment. A woman's economic security was almost entirely tied to her male relatives. As a daughter, she was dependent on her father. As a wife, her sustenance came from her husband. If a husband died, especially without male heirs, or if he had squandered his assets, his widow could find herself in an extremely vulnerable position. While some widows might inherit property or gain a measure of independence, many faced the very real threat of poverty, forced to rely on the charity of relatives, the kindness of the church, or even to resort to begging. Imagine the gnawing fear that your husband, your sole provider, might die prematurely, leaving you and your children to face the harsh realities of a world with no social safety net. This fear was not abstract. Mortality rates were high, and death could strike suddenly, leaving a woman scrambling for survival. The threat of marital instability, while not as common as death, was another source of profound anxiety. While divorce, as we understand, it was nearly impossible, annulment, or the formal separation of spouses, could occur, though it was rare and often difficult to obtain. However, a husband held significant power over his wife within the marriage. He could, for instance, accuse her of infidelity, a charge that, if proven or even widely believed, could lead to severe social ostracism, the loss of her children, and complete ruin. A woman had little recourse if her husband was abusive, whether physically or emotionally. Legal protections were minimal, and societal norms often condoned a husband's authority, even when harsh. A wife could be publicly shamed, beaten, or locked away without legal recourse. Chronicles from the time, while often written by men, sometimes hint at the dire consequences faced by women who fell out of favor with their powerful husbands or were accused of impropriety. Dr. Christine Ladd, in her examination of medieval domestic life, Beneath the Cloak and Veil, points out how the threat of a husband's displeasure or accusation hung over women, forcing them into a constant state of hypervigilance, eager to please and avoid any perceived wrongdoing. Beyond the domestic sphere, the lack of legal protection exposed women to external dangers. A woman traveling alone, even if she had legitimate business, was viewed with suspicion and was highly vulnerable to assault. The legal system, while sometimes offering some protection, often placed the burden of proof on the woman, and her testimony might be questioned. Pervasive belief in female weakness and susceptibility also contributed to a climate where women were seen as easier targets. This created a generalized fear of the outside world, making women often confined to the perceived safety of their homes or communities, further limiting their personal freedom. Childbirth itself was a significant source of anxiety and fear. Mortality rates for both mothers and infants were tragically high. A woman might endure multiple pregnancies, knowing that each one carried a substantial risk to her life. Pain was immense, medical knowledge primitive, and the potential for complications ever present. Chronicles from the Abbey of St. Denis, though not specifically focusing on women's experiences, frequently recorded the deaths of noblewomen in childbirth, a grim testament to the dangers. Imagine the recurring dread with each new pregnancy, the fear of leaving orphaned children, or the terror of your own life ending in excruciating pain. This was not just a physical toll, but a profound psychological burden, a recurring cycle of fear. Finally, there was the constant fear of social condemnation and gossip. In close-knit medieval communities, reputation was everything. A woman's honor was intertwined with her family's standing. Any perceived deviation from societal norms, speaking out of turn, being too independent, not being sufficiently pious, or any hint of sexual impropriety could lead to severe social repercussions. Shaming, ostracization, or even public humiliation were powerful tools of social control. This pressure to constantly adhere to societal expectations, to be beyond reproach in every action and word, created a pervasive sense of anxiety, a constant vigilance over one's own behavior and appearance. This environment of fear, both real and imagined, created a constant background noise of apprehension in a woman's life, making genuine peace of mind a rare and precious commodity. Number 4, the silent burden of unspoken truths. Imagine a life where your thoughts, your opinions, your feelings are not merely ignored, but actively suppressed, where speaking your mind could lead to censure, punishment, or even danger. This is the silent burden of unspoken truths, a heavy psychological toll on women in 1118, forcing them to internalize their experiences and desires, creating a profound sense of isolation and emotional weight. In the social structure of 1118, male authority was paramount. In the home, the husband was the undisputed head of the household. His decisions were law, his word final. A wife's role was to obey, to manage the domestic sphere according to his directives, and to foster peace within the family unit. Contradict him, to openly express disagreement, or to challenge his authority was not just impolite. It was seen as insubordination, a threat to the established order. This expectation of unquestioning obedience meant that women often had to bite their tongues, swallow their criticisms, and mask their true feelings. Imagine a wife who sees a more efficient way to manage the harvest, or who believes a certain trade deal is foolish, or who suspects a neighbor of dishonesty, yet she cannot voice her concerns if they contradict her husband's view. She is forced to hold her tongue, to watch potential mistakes unfold, or to endure injustices in silence. This constant self-censorship, the daily practice of suppressing one's own voice, accumulates over time, leading to a profound sense of powerlessness and frustration. Beyond the domestic sphere, women's voices were largely absent from public life. They could not speak in court, hold public office, or participate in political discussions. Even within village meetings or communal gatherings, women were often expected to remain silent, their presence acknowledged but their opinions rarely sought or valued. If a woman possessed valuable insights or intelligent observations, they might go unexpressed, unheard, and ultimately lost. This denial of a public platform for expression further cemented the idea that women's thoughts were simply less important, less valid, or less worthy of being heard. Dr. Helen Park, a scholar of medieval social structures, discusses in The Muted Echoes how the suppression of women's voices wasn't merely a matter of custom, but a deliberate mechanism of control, ensuring that male narratives and perspectives dominated all aspects of society. The church, too, contributed to this silent burden. While women were devout and participated in religious life, their role in theological discourse was almost non-existent. Women were not generally permitted to preach, teach, or interpret scripture. Even in convents, where women had more intellectual opportunities, their theological writings or spiritual insights were often filtered through male confessors or superiors before gaining any wider recognition, if at all. The very language of religious authority was male, further marginalizing female perspectives. Imagine a devout woman with deep spiritual experiences or profound questions about faith, yet finding no legitimate avenue to articulate them or engage in meaningful spiritual debate. Her insights remain private, her revelations unspoken. This constant suppression of voice extended to personal grievances and emotional needs. If a woman was mistreated, whether by her husband, her in-laws, or others, her options for seeking redress were extremely limited. She could not easily turn to legal authorities. She might confide in a female relative or a trusted friend, but even then, these conversations would be clandestine, away from male ears, with little hope of concrete action. Fear of social backlash, of being branded a troublemaker or a disobedient wife, often outweighed the desperate need to speak out. This forced silence in the face of injustice, the inability to articulate pain or demand fairness, could lead to deep emotional scarring, fostering resentment and despair. The silent burden of unspoken truths created a profound sense of emotional isolation. You cannot share your true feelings, your fears, your hopes, or your disappointments, even with those closest to you, then a part of you remains hidden and unacknowledged. This emotional bottling could lead to chronic stress, anxiety, and a feeling of being perpetually misunderstood. A woman might carry within her a vibrant inner world, filled with intelligence, creativity, and deep emotions, yet be forced to present a docile, compliant exterior to the world. The dissonance between her inner self and her outward performance was a heavy psychological weight, a constant, quiet battle that was fought alone, day after day, year after year, with no end in sight. Number 3, the strain of forced performance. Imagine living your entire life as if on a stage, constantly performing a role assigned to you, with little room for improvisation or authentic expression. This is the psychological toll of the strain of forced performance, a relentless demand on women in 1118 to embody prescribed ideals of womanhood, often at the cost of their true selves. From a young age, girls were rigorously trained for their future roles, as obedient daughters, diligent wives, and nurturing mothers. For a peasant girl, this meant mastering the demanding tasks of the household, cooking over an open hearth, spinning wool, weaving cloth, tending to a small garden, preserving food, and raising children. For a noblewoman, the performance was different in its specifics but equally demanding, managing a large household, overseeing numerous servants, knowing the intricate rules of courtly etiquette, engaging in feminine pursuits like embroidery, and maintaining a dignified, pious demeanor. In both cases, the performance was not just about doing the tasks, but doing them in a specific way that reflected the societal ideals of a virtuous and competent woman. Consider the act of marriage. For a woman, it was a pivotal performance. She had to transition from a daughter to a wife, often in a new household with new rules and expectations. She had to gain the approval of her husband, his family, and the wider community. Fertility was central to her success, and the pressure to produce male heirs was immense, particularly for noblewomen. Every pregnancy, every birth, was a public performance of her biological duty. If she struggled to conceive, or if she bore only daughters, she might face social disapproval, a sense of failure, and even the threat of her husband seeking an annulment or taking a mistress to secure an heir. The intense pressure to fulfill this reproductive role was a profound performance, a constant awareness that her body was under scrutiny and her worth tied to its output. Beyond the domestic sphere and reproduction, women were expected to perform emotional labor constantly. This meant managing the moods and needs of her husband, her children, and other members of the household or community. She was expected to be a calming presence, a mediator, a source of comfort and unwavering support. This emotional vigilance, the constant anticipation of others' needs and emotions, meant that her own emotional landscape often went unaddressed. She might suppress her own grief, anger, or sadness to maintain a facade of serenity and strength for her family. Scholars of medieval domestic life, like Dr. Sarah Graham, in her examination of emotional roles in The Silent Caregivers, describe how women were systematically trained to prioritize the emotional well-being of others above their own, a relentless and exhausting performance. The pressure to embody piety was another key performance. Women were expected to be devout, attending church regularly, praying, and engaging in charitable acts. For some, this was genuine spiritual devotion, but for many, it was also a societal expectation, a public display of virtue that enhanced their reputation and that of their family. To be seen as impious or worldly was a serious social transgression. This meant constantly presenting oneself as humble, modest, and dedicated to spiritual matters, even if one harbored doubts or personal desires that conflicted with rigid religious expectations. This constant performance of societal roles, this relentless striving to meet external expectations, was profoundly exhausting. It left little room for genuine self-expression or personal development. A woman might have artistic talents, intellectual curiosities, or a desire for adventure, but these were often suppressed, deemed inappropriate for her role. To pursue them would be to deviate from the script, to risk social censure and disruption to the delicate balance of her life. Imagine the psychological toll of always being on, always playing a part, always measuring your worth against an externally defined standard. This forced performance created a deep divide between a woman's public persona and her private self, leading to a pervasive sense of inauthenticity and a quiet despair over the loss of her true identity. The strain of this relentless acting was a heavy, often unseen, burden, making genuine joy and personal fulfillment feel perpetually out of reach. Number 2, the weight of diminished identity. Imagine a world where your individual name, your unique characteristics, and your personal aspirations seem to dissolve, replaced by a series of labels that define your entire existence: daughter, wife, mother, servant, widow, nun. This is the profound psychological toll of the weight of diminished identity, a feeling that your very self is reduced to a set of predefined roles, with little room for personal recognition or individual worth beyond these functions. In 1118, a woman's identity was almost entirely relational. She was defined by her relationship to a male. She was daughter of until she became wife of. Family name, if she even had one that was distinct from her male relatives, often ceased to be her primary identifier upon marriage. Instead, she became the wife of Master John, or Lady Elara, consort of Baron Robert. Her social status was almost entirely derived from her father or husband. She rarely had a standing independent of these relationships. This constant external definition, where her value was tied to her connection to a man, made it incredibly difficult for a woman to cultivate an internal sense of self-worth based on her own merits or qualities. Consider a woman's personal property. While she might bring a dowry into a marriage, that property often came under the control of her husband. She didn't own it in the way a man might. Even her body was often considered the property of her husband, especially in matters of procreation. This lack of control over material possessions, and even her own physical being, reinforced the idea that she was not an independent entity, but rather a valuable asset to be managed by male authority. Imagine never truly possessing anything outright, always being a temporary custodian of resources that ultimately belonged to someone else. This absence of personal ownership extended metaphorically to her very self, making it feel like a borrowed existence. Legal standing also played a crucial role in diminishing identity. As we discussed earlier, women generally could not act as independent legal agents. They could not typically sign contracts, initiate lawsuits, or testify independently in court. This legal invisibility meant that, in the eyes of the formal system, a woman's individual agency and personhood were largely unrecognized. She existed through her male guardian. When the state, the highest form of organized society, fails to recognize you as a distinct individual with rights and responsibilities, it sends a powerful message that your identity is, at best, secondary, at worst, irrelevant. Even within religious life, while a nun might escape some of the direct patriarchal control of marriage, her identity was still largely subsumed by her religious order and her vows. She became Sister Agnes, her life dedicated to God and the community, her personal desires and ambitions often set aside in favor of spiritual service. While this offered a different kind of life, it still often involved a diminishing of individual identity in favor of a collective or prescribed one. The psychological impact of this diminished identity was profound. If your worth is constantly tied to your utility to others, your ability to bear children, to manage a household, to bring an alliance, to serve a lord, then what happens to the innate sense of who you are as an individual? What happens to your unique talents, your personal preferences, your inner world of thoughts and feelings? They become secondary, often irrelevant. Imagine a woman who is incredibly skilled at storytelling, or a natural leader, or a brilliant strategist. Yet these talents are never recognized or encouraged because they do not fit the prescribed roles of wife or mother. Instead, they are suppressed, or perhaps channeled into mundane tasks. This constant reduction of self to function led to a pervasive feeling of being unseen and unvalued for one's true self. It created a quiet loneliness, a sense that the rich inner landscape of one's being was invisible to the world. The weight of diminished identity was like a constant erosion, slowly wearing away at the edges of a woman's individuality, leaving behind a profound question. If I am not merely daughter of, wife of, or mother of, then who am I really? And does anyone even care to know? This existential uncertainty, this loss of self in a sea of prescribed roles was a heavy and often unacknowledged burden. Number 1, the echo of unfulfilled potential. Imagine harboring talents, dreams, and aspirations, a vibrant inner world of curiosity and capability, only to see them wither and die, uncultivated and unrecognized, simply because of your gender. This is the most heartbreaking psychological toll of constant subordination for women in 1118, the echo of unfulfilled potential. It is the silent lament of what could have been, the quiet despair of talents and intelligence that never found a fertile ground to flourish. In 1118, formal education for girls was largely non-existent, unless you were a noblewoman receiving rudimentary literacy at home, or, more significantly, a woman entering a convent. For the vast majority, intellectual development beyond practical household skills was neither encouraged nor accessible. If a girl showed a natural aptitude for mathematics, perhaps she could apply it to managing household accounts, but she would never study geometry or astronomy. If she possessed a brilliant mind for strategy, it might be confined to managing a complex kitchen, never tested on a battlefield or in a royal council. The societal structures simply did not provide the pathways for women to develop their intellectual capacities beyond the domestic or the devotional. Scholars like Professor Ann Kelly, in her extensive work, The Uncharted Minds, argue that this systematic denial of educational opportunities was not just a practical limitation, but a profound psychological barrier, preventing women from even conceiving of their full intellectual potential. Think about creativity. While women certainly engaged in creative endeavors, weaving intricate patterns, embroidering detailed tapestries, crafting beautiful pottery, these were often seen as domestic skills, not as high art. A woman might be a gifted composer of songs, but her melodies would likely remain within the confines of her village or her household, never heard in a grand cathedral or widely published. A woman with a knack for storytelling might enthrall her children by the hearth, but her narratives would rarely be recorded in chronicles or performed by traveling minstrels. The avenues for women to gain recognition for their artistic genius were severely limited, often pushing their creative output into the realm of the anonymous or the unseen. The world was poorer for these lost masterpieces, and the women themselves were left with a profound sense of their gifts being unacknowledged and unvalued. Beyond intellectual and creative pursuits, imagine a woman with a natural talent for leadership, a sharp wit, or an innate ability to inspire others. In a different world, she might have been a powerful queen, a respected scholar, a revolutionary leader. But in 1118, such qualities in a woman were often viewed with suspicion, as unnatural or even dangerous. A woman who was too assertive, too intelligent, or too outspoken risked social ostracization or work. These talents, therefore, had to be suppressed, channeled into subtle manipulation within the household, or simply remained dormant. The potential leader became a quiet manager, the sharp wit became a silent observer, and the inspiring voice became a soft lullaby. The psychological toll of constantly stifling one's true nature, of hiding one's strengths for fear of negative repercussions, led to a deep, underlying sense of frustration and regret. This unfulfilled potential wasn't just about what women couldn't do, it was also about who they couldn't become. It was the loss of personal growth, the inability to explore the full breadth of their capabilities, the quiet despair of dreams deferred or never even dared to dream. Every woman in 1118, regardless of her social standing, carried within her a unique constellation of talents, intelligence, and aspirations. Yet the rigid social, religious, and legal structures of the time acted as an invisible cage, preventing these potentials from taking flight. Constant echo of what could have been, the quiet knowledge of talents that were never fully realized, created a pervasive sadness, a feeling of being incomplete or diminished not by personal failing, but by the very circumstances of one's birth. This unfulfilled potential was a silent, personal tragedy played out in countless lives, a testament to the profound and lasting psychological damage of constant subordination.